haunted by my children.
In the western hills of Uganda, beyond the trading centers where radios crackled with distant music, and deeper into the villages where night still belonged to darkness instead of electricity, there once lived a man named Yokana. A man whose hunger for wealth grew so large that it eventually swallowed everything human inside him. People who knew him as a young man used to speak of how hard-working he was, how he could wake before the roosters and return from the fields long after sunset, with mud on his legs and determination burning in his eyes. He was not born into wealth. His father died, leaving behind only a leaking mud house and a few exhausted goats that looked more like survivors than livestock. And from childhood, Yokana carried a bitterness that settled deep in him like a thorn beneath skin. He hated poverty with a passion that frightened even his mother. Whenever rain leaked through the roof and soaked his sleeping mat, he would sit awake, trembling with anger, while other children laughed and slept through storms. And he would to himself, "One day I will have so much money that even suffering will fear me." At first, people admired that ambition because poverty is cruel, and in villages where children go to sleep listening to their parents worry about food, a person who dreams of escape is often respected. But there are dreams that slowly rot from the inside, and Yokana's dream began to smell of something dark long before anyone realized it. As he grew older, strange things followed him like invisible dogs. His crops flourished even when neighboring farms dried beneath harsh sun. His goats multiplied unnaturally fast. Money began appearing in his hands without explanation, and though he never openly displayed wealth, people noticed that he no longer struggled the way others did. His wife, Miriam, once asked him in a low voice while they lay in bed listening to crickets outside, "Yokana, where is all this coming from?" And he turned toward her slowly, the moonlight catching only half his face as he replied, "Would you rather I stayed poor forever?" She felt cold hearing those words because they did not sound defensive, they sounded warning. And after that, she stopped asking questions she did not truly want answered. But the village noticed more than wealth. They noticed children disappearing. Not many at first. One child from a neighboring village, then another months later, then another. Sometimes the bodies were found near swamps or forests, twisted in ways that made grown men look away, and other times they were never found at all. Fear spread carefully through the communities like smoke beneath a door, slow and suffocating. Mothers stopped letting children walk alone after sunset. Fires burned later into the night because darkness itself began to feel occupied by something watching from just beyond sight. Then came the disappearance of the twins. The entire village remembered that night because the rain had fallen violently, pounding roofs like fists while thunder rolled across the hills. The twins, barely 7 years old, had vanished from their sleeping mats without a sound. Their mother ran through the village screaming their names until her voice broke apart into animal sounds no one who heard them ever forgot. Men searched the forests carrying lanterns and machetes, while dogs barked wildly at shadows, but dawn came with nothing except mud and silence. It was 3 days later when one of the children was found near an abandoned shrine deep in the banana groves, and even the elders who had seen death many times in their lives became pale at the sight. The child's body looked drained, almost collapsed inward, the skin stretched too tightly against bone, the eyes open impossibly wide, as though death itself had terrified him. The second twin was never found. Never. And from that moment, suspicion began circling Yokana openly because people remembered something they had tried to ignore for too long. Every time tragedy struck, Yokana somehow became wealthier afterward. A new cow, more land, better clothes, his compound growing larger while grief swallowed the rest of the village. One evening, an old herbalist named Kafumbe arrived unexpectedly from another district after hearing whispers about the disappearances. He was ancient, bent like a dying tree branch, with cataract-clouded eyes that still somehow seemed capable of seeing too much. When he entered the village, people gathered around him desperately, speaking over one another until he raised a trembling hand and said, "Silence. Fear makes too much noise to hear truth." He spent the day walking through the village slowly, stopping at strange places, touching the ground, muttering beneath his breath. And when he finally reached Yokana's compound, he stood perfectly still for such a long time that even the wind seemed to hesitate. Yokana emerged from his house, forcing a smile onto his face, and said loudly, "Old man, why are you standing in my yard like a ghost?" Kafumbe turned his milky eyes toward him and answered in a voice so quiet everyone had to lean closer to hear. "Because something buried beneath your shadow is feeding." Those words struck the gathered villagers like lightning. Yokana laughed too quickly, too loudly, and replied, "People are grieving and looking for someone to blame, that is all." But sweat had already begun gathering on his forehead despite the cool evening air. That night the elders met in secret, and by dawn they had made their decision. They came for Yokana before sunrise while fog still clung low to the ground, and although he denied everything fiercely, screaming and fighting as they tied his hands, the fear in his eyes betrayed him more than any confession could. "You have no proof!" he shouted as they dragged him toward the center of the village. "You are accusing me because you envy what I have!" But then Kafumbe stepped forward, holding a small animal horn filled with dark powder, and said, "Then let the spirits deny it." He threw the powder into a fire, and immediately the flames twisted green. The villagers gasped and stumbled backward as the smoke thickened unnaturally, curling toward Yokana like reaching fingers. For the first time since his capture, true terror exploded across Yokana's face. He began screaming, not in anger now, but in panic. "Stop! Stop! You do not understand what you are touching!" And that was the moment everyone knew, truly knew. Because innocent men fear punishment. Guilty men fear exposure. They beat him brutally before dragging him to an abandoned hut near the edge of the village.
If these are the kinds of stories you love to watch and listen to, subscribe to Pearl Mystic Tales on YouTube and TikTok. We share real historical events told in a way that helps you see them, feel them, and understand them differently.
Where rituals were performed to force confessions from those believed to practice dark magic. Bound tightly to a wooden pole, bleeding from his mouth, Yokana finally broke. Between ragged breaths he confessed to things so horrifying that even the men who hated him felt sickness rise in their stomachs listening to him speak. He admitted to visiting witch doctors deep in the forests near the Congo border, men who promised wealth in exchange for blood. He spoke of ceremonies performed beneath moonless skies, of animal sacrifices that slowly became human sacrifices, because, as the witch doctor told him, the spirits grow hungry the more they feed. Then came the worst part, the children. Yokana began sobbing uncontrollably as he whispered, "They said children carry the strongest life, the purest. The spirits wanted purity." And several villagers walked out unable to listen further, while others stared at him with such hatred it felt almost physical. The mothers of the missing children wailed until their voices cracked apart. One man lunged forward with a machete, screaming, "Monster!" But the elders restrained him because they wanted Yokana alive long enough for everyone to hear the truth. He was sentenced not by law, but by fury. The villagers decided he would remain tied inside the abandoned hut until authorities from the nearest town arrived, but something far worse reached him first. That very night, after the village finally fell into uneasy silence, Yokana heard the sound of children laughing outside the hut. At first, he thought exhaustion had begun breaking his mind because the laughter sounded distant and playful, almost normal. But then it came closer, closer, right outside the door. Tiny footsteps circled the hut slowly, while soft voices whispered his name. "Yokana," one child giggled. "We are cold." His entire body stiffened. "Who is there?" he shouted desperately, but the voices only laughed harder. Then came scratching against the walls, tiny fingernails dragging across wood. "Wake up," another voice whispered directly beside his ear, though no one stood there. "Do not sleep yet." Morning came, and Yokana looked transformed already. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale and slick with sweat. The villagers mocked him at first, assuming fear had finally destroyed his courage. But when night returned, the sounds began again. Children whispering. Children laughing. Tiny feet running across the roof. Every time exhaustion dragged his eyes shut, cold little voices would hiss sharply into his ears. Wake up! Work harder! You wanted money! And he would jolt awake, screaming. By the fourth night, he was begging not to be left alone. Please, he cried as the elders locked the hut. Please don't leave me with them. But the villagers ignored him because many secretly believed this haunting was justice itself unfolding. The children never touched him physically. That was the horror. They simply never allowed him rest. Whenever sleep began pulling him under, they woke him instantly. Sometimes by whispering beside his face. Sometimes by banging on the walls violently. Sometimes by singing nursery songs in broken voices that sounded wet and hollow, as though their throats were full of river water. Yokana began seeing them even while awake. Small figures standing outside the hut, staring silently. Mud-covered feet beneath the door. Tiny fingerprints appearing across his chest while he screamed and clawed at himself. Go work, they would whisper together. You wanted riches. Go work for more. The mockery drove him mad because they repeated the very hunger that had destroyed him. The same greed, the same obsession. Weeks passed, and Yokana deteriorated into something barely human. Sleep deprivation hollowed him out slowly and cruelly. His hands trembled constantly, his speech fractured. Sometimes he laughed hysterically at nothing before suddenly bursting into tears. His family stopped visiting because the sight of him became unbearable. Even his wife refused to look at him after hearing the full truth. You fed our life with children's blood, she spat at him during her final visit. You brought evil into our home while I slept beside you. He collapsed at her feet, sobbing, reaching desperately for forgiveness, but she stepped away as though his touch itself carried contamination. By the final days, Yokana could no longer tell dreams from waking life. He screamed through entire nights, begging invisible children to let him rest just for a moment. Villagers heard him shouting things like, I gave you enough, and, please, I was poor, I only wanted a better life, before breaking into hysterical sobs. Then one night, after nearly 3 weeks without true sleep, the village awoke to a terrible sound coming from the hut. Laughter mixed with crying. When the elders opened the door, they found Yokana curled tightly in the corner, staring upward at dozens of tiny, muddy footprints covering the ceiling above him. His lips trembled violently as he whispered, They are here. They never stop watching. Every time I close my eyes, they stand beside me. One elder knelt beside him and asked quietly, What exactly did you do? And Yokana finally confessed everything fully. Every ritual, every child, every horrifying detail he had hidden even during his first confession. He spoke until sunrise, his voice breaking apart while tears and mucus covered his face. By the end, even the strongest men could not meet his eyes anymore. Yokana died that afternoon before sunset. Not from wounds, not from sickness, but from complete exhaustion. His body simply gave up after too many nights trapped between guilt and terror. His final words were whispered weakly into the air while staring at something no one else could see. Please, let me sleep now. Then his breathing stopped. No one mourned him. His family buried him quickly in an unmarked grave far from the village. No prayers, no songs. Mothers spat into the dirt as his body was lowered. Even children were warned never to speak his name again. But years later, old villagers still swore that on quiet nights, if one passed near the abandoned hut where he had been held, faint children's laughter could still be heard drifting through the darkness, followed by a man's exhausted voice begging over and over again for just a little sleep.